Welcome back to Mr. Sandman, where the stories we share are far from comforting. Here we don't guide you to sleep. We open doors to the unknown, where darkness lurks and the unknown waits for you to listen. The whispers in the dark, they're waiting for you to hear them. Tonight, take a step closer to the edge. Let the coldness of the stories watch over you. But beware sometimes. The scariest monsters are the ones that live in our own mind. Are you ready? Then close your eyes. Or better yet, don't. Our first story tonight is titled The Perfect Wife.
Laura Grayson was the kind of woman everyone admired. In her small town, she seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, 2 adorable children, and a charming, successful husband named Darren. She was the mother who always volunteered for bake sales, who showed up at PTA meetings with fresh coffee for everyone, and who had an endless supply of warm smiles and gracious conversation. But the truth was, Laura was trapped. For years, her life had been an unending cycle of control and criticism from Darren, who was respected around town as a charismatic businessman. Behind closed doors, he was cold, calculating, and methodically cruel. He controlled the family's money, monitoring every purchase she made. He criticized her every move, calling her lazy and incompetent. Her friends had stopped calling, and Darren made sure she knew it was because she wasn't worth anyone's time. Isolation became her reality, and she buried her pain beneath the facade of perfection. Then one evening, Laura noticed a strange charge on their credit card statement: a luxury hotel stay on a weekend when Darren had been out of town for business. Her heart raced as she thought back to that weekend and realized he'd never called, never checked in on her or the kids. Suspicion gnawed at her, and she waited until he was asleep, then quietly took his phone from the nightstand and unlocked it, hands trembling. The messages she found confirmed her darkest fears. Darren had been having an affair with April, her closest friend. The 2 of them had been sneaking around for months, exchanging messages about the thrill of secrecy, mocking her, even sharing intimate details of her life and her insecurities. Laura felt the ground fall out from under her. She had been humiliated, used, and dismissed by the people she trusted most. The next day, Laura confronted Darren, her voice barely containing the anger boiling inside her. But Darren didn't flinch. He simply shrugged, looked her straight in the eye, and told her that he was done pretending. He blamed her for the affair, said she was pathetic, a failure of a wife. As he turned his back on her and went upstairs, Laura felt something inside her snap. In the days that followed, Laura's mind became a whirlwind of rage and dark thoughts. She had given everything to this man: her love, her loyalty, her very identity, and he had taken it all without a second thought. At first, she only thought of confronting April, to demand an explanation and maybe some sign of regret, but each night she stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining their faces, the betrayal in their eyes. Her anger grew sharper. One cold November evening, after Darren had gone to bed, Laura went down to the basement, where Darren had stashed his old tools. She found a rusted hammer, heavy and solid, and felt its weight in her hand. She wasn't sure if she had the nerve to go through with what she was thinking, but every time she pictured Darren's dismissive face and April's mocking texts, her resolve hardened. Just after midnight, Laura slipped out of the house, hammer in hand, and drove the few blocks to April's. She rehearsed what she would say, imagining April's shock, her panic. When she reached April's door, she tried to calm herself, wiping the sweat from her brow, steadying her breathing. When April opened the door, she looked surprised but quickly smiled, assuming Laura was stopping by for a friendly chat. Laura forced a smile back and whispered, "Can I come in? I just need to talk." Once inside, Laura dropped the friendly pretense. Her voice grew cold, and her expression twisted with anger. "How could you?" she asked, venom dripping from every word. "I trusted you. I thought you were my friend." April's face paled and she stammered, trying to explain herself, but Laura didn't want to hear it. Her grip tightened around the hammer, and in a moment of blind rage, she swung it, feeling the impact reverberate through her arm. The room was filled with April's screams, but Laura's fury had numbed her to everything else. By the time the night was over, Laura was exhausted, physically and mentally. She left April's house in a daze, covered in blood and without a plan. She hadn't thought beyond this moment, and now the consequences loomed over her like a shadow. The next morning, Darren reported her missing, claiming he had no idea where his wife was. He played the concerned husband, even giving teary interviews to the local news. But as the investigation unfolded, detectives began to notice small inconsistencies in Darren's story. And when they found April's body, it didn't take long for them to find Laura's fingerprints on the weapon. When they finally tracked Laura down, she was hiding in an abandoned cabin just outside town, her mind shattered and her body gaunt from days without sleep. She didn't fight when they put her in handcuffs. The woman the world had known as the perfect wife and mother was gone, replaced by a hollow shell. As the trial began, people flocked to the courtroom, unable to believe that Laura Grayson, the beloved face of their community, had committed such a brutal act. But as the details of Darren's infidelity and abuse came to light, sympathy grew for Laura. Some people even saw her as a victim, a woman who had been driven to her breaking point. Others thought she was just as cold and calculating murderer. In the end, Laura's sentence would be life in prison, her children left without a mother, and, in the quiet town where Laura had once been a beacon of grace and goodness, her story became a cautionary tale, a dark reminder of what can happen when a person, even someone you think you know, is pushed too far.
For our second story tonight, we'll be reading The Haunting of Cedar Lane.
When Alice moved into her new home on Cedar Lane, she thought it was the start of a new chapter. She'd left the city for the quiet of the countryside, hoping to escape the noise, stress, and claustrophobia that had plagued her life. Her new home was an old Victorian, the kind of place that felt rich with history. It had dark mahogany wood, original molding, and stained glass windows that cast haunting shades of red and green onto the worn floors. Though the house had been vacant for years, Alice was captivated by it, until strange things began to happen. At first, the oddities were small, almost dismissible. Shadows seemed to flicker in the corner of her eye, or she'd feel a chill pass through her that she shrugged off as a draft. But as the days went on, those small moments escalated. One evening, she found herself in the hallway, mesmerized by an unusual sound. It was faint at first, almost like the scratch of a mouse. As she listened, the scratching grew louder, morphing into a distinct tapping, as though someone were knocking from within the walls. She pressed her ear to the wall, her pulse quickening. Tap, tap, tap. Her breath fogged against the wallpaper, and she could have sworn she heard faint whispering, barely audible, as if carried on a hidden breeze. That night she struggled to sleep, tossing and turning until she was pulled into a restless, uneasy slumber. In her dreams, she found herself walking through the dark hallways of her new home, except everything felt strange, oppressive. Shadows pooled in the corners, and she had the distinct feeling of being watched. The tapping sound returned, this time louder, relentless. It felt as though something was lurking just beyond her vision, waiting for her to turn around. Alice woke drenched in sweat, the eerie rhythm of her nightmare still echoing in her ears. She dismissed it as stress from the move and tried to brush it off, though she found herself avoiding the hallway where she'd heard the tapping. The following week, things took a darker turn. Alice began to notice items moving on their own. One morning, she set her coffee mug down on the kitchen counter, only to turn and find it on the opposite side of the room. Her keys would disappear from her purse, only to reappear in random places, like the attic or the basement. Each time she felt a pang of unease, a feeling that something or someone was watching her, playing a twisted game. Desperate to understand what was happening, Alice invited her friend Clara over for a visit. She didn't tell Clara about the strange occurrences, afraid of sounding paranoid. But as they sat in the living room, Clara grew unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on the corner of the room. "Do you feel that?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alice's heart skipped a beat. "Feel what?" "It's cold," Clara said, rubbing her arms, though the fire in the hearth crackled and burned brightly. "And I swear I just saw something moving." Alice tried to laugh it off, but Clara's unease was contagious. As they sat in silence, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Both women froze. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, like heavy boots pacing just out of sight. Alice stood up, her heart racing, and flicked on the hallway light. The corridor was empty, yet the footsteps persisted, louder now, like someone or something was drawing closer. Panicked, Clara left, her face pale, muttering apologies. Alice spent the rest of the night huddled under her blankets, every creak of the old house amplified in the stillness. She barely slept, her mind spinning with doubt and fear. The next day, Alice resolved to get to the bottom of the mystery. She scoured the internet, reading about hauntings and paranormal encounters, trying to find answers. She learned that sometimes old houses held onto the memories of those who'd lived and died within their walls. The deeper she dug, the more she uncovered about the history of Cedar Lane. It turned out that her house had once belonged to a man named Elias Thatcher, a reclusive doctor who had practiced in the early 1900s. Rumor had it that Thatcher had performed unorthodox experiments in his basement, his obsession with the dead driving him to madness. Locals claimed he'd been searching for a way to bring back the souls of the departed. People said he died in that very house, his spirit restless, his experiments unfinished. That night, Alice ventured into the basement. The air grew thick and stale as she descended, the darkness wrapping around her like a shroud. She flicked on her flashlight and moved it over the cobwebbed shelves and dusty crates. In the far corner, she noticed a large iron-bound chest with a thick padlock. Her hand trembled as she reached for it, feeling an intense pull, a morbid curiosity, a compulsion she couldn't explain. She pried open the lock and lifted the lid, and the smell of rot and decay hit her in a suffocating wave. Inside were leather-bound journals, faded with age and stained with what looked disturbingly like dried blood. She flipped through one of them, her hands shaking as she read Thatcher's meticulous notes. The words were rambling, frantic, describing his experiments on capturing the spirits of the dead. His final entries were nearly illegible, his handwriting chaotic, as if he'd been possessed by an uncontrollable force. Alice slammed the journal shut, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. She'd uncovered a dark secret, a cursed legacy left by a man consumed by his obsession with death. And she had no doubt that whatever presence haunted her home was connected to his twisted work. Over the following days, the haunting grew more intense. Every night, she heard footsteps echoing through the house, the relentless tapping on the walls, and the whispering voices that grew louder, more demanding. Sometimes she'd wake to find herself standing in the middle of the hallway, disoriented and trembling, unable to remember how she'd gotten there. One night, as she lay in bed, she felt an icy touch graze her arm, as if invisible fingers were brushing her skin. She jolted up, eyes wide, and saw a figure at the foot of her bed, a dark silhouette, shrouded in shadow. The figure had no face, only a hollow darkness where eyes should have been. It stood silently, watching her, its presence thick with malice. Alice couldn't breathe, paralyzed by fear as the figure moved closer. It reached out and she felt a sharp pain, like needles piercing her skin. She screamed, scrambling out of bed and bolting for the door, but her legs felt heavy, as though they were sinking into the floor. The room filled with a deafening noise, a high-pitched wail that reverberated through her skull. She finally broke free and ran down the stairs, her mind a frenzy of terror. She stumbled out the front door, gasping for air, her body shaking violently. She didn't look back as she fled down the dark road, leaving the cursed house and its shadows behind. Days later, Alice returned with a priest, determined to cleanse the house. But as they walked through the empty rooms, she could still feel the presence lurking, hiding just beyond sight. The priest performed blessings, sprinkling holy water and chanting prayers, but Alice knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The house would never truly be free of Elias Thatcher's spirit or the darkness he had conjured. And as she left Cedar Lane for the final time, she heard a faint, familiar tapping from within the walls, a reminder that some spirits never rest